Hello, my name is Nick Deborah. I'm an independent consultant and educator in the fields of data visualization and dashboard design. And this video is a recording of the introductory section of a data visualization fundamentals workshop that I deliver called Practical Charts. The rest of the course is available as a live online workshop that lasts 4 half days. If you'd like information about scheduling a private workshop, or if you'd like to register for one of the open registration workshops that we hold throughout the year, please visit my website, practicalreporting.com. If you're already registered for a Practical Charts workshop, I decided to pre-record this early part of the workshop and ask participants to watch it beforehand, since this both frees up time during the workshop for more group activities and hands-on practice exercises. And I also noticed that this early part of the workshop tends to be less interactive than later on when we are doing those group exercises and activities. If you have questions or comments about anything in this video, though, make sure to write them down, because at the beginning of the live workshop, you'll have the opportunity to ask those questions or make those comments. I'll also be speaking a little bit more quickly in this video than I would during a live workshop, because since it is pre-recorded, you can, of course, pause and rewind, watch sections again if you want to go through it a little bit more slowly, and of course, even change the playback speed in YouTube. All right, so what exactly are we going to see in this video? Well, first, I'm going to spend a very brief amount of time introducing myself and this course. And then we're going to talk about 9 common data visualization myths, common misconceptions that people have about data visualization, the 6 reasons why charts fail, and then a brief overview of the rest of the live workshop course. So very briefly, I've been doing this kind of work for a long time. I've taught data visualization and dashboard design to thousands of people in many different countries. Pretty broad variety of organizations. A few of them are listed here. As you can see, there's manufacturing, banking, private sector, public sector, pretty wide variety of organizations. And all of these organizations tend to think that they have unique data visualization challenges, and yet in my experience, they're remarkably similar. 90+% overlap, regardless of which organization you work with. I've done a lot of dashboard design for various organizations, but we're not going to talk about dashboards. I have another course which deals with dashboards. I have done visualizations that have been featured on many different major media outlets, and I have a software background, but this is not a course about software. Sometimes people tend to think that, this is a technical course. It's about Excel or Tableau or Click or something like that. No, in fact, most of this course is actually about psychology, the psychology of perception and decision making, because of course, ultimately that's the number one reason why we create charts, is to make better decisions. From 2014 to 2019, I taught the courses of Stephen Few. A lot of you probably know Steve if you've been paying any attention at all to the data visualization field for the last 15 or 20 years. And Steve decided to retire from teaching in 2018. I continued to teach his courses, but I also started developing my own courses, including this one. And so this course is not a Stephen Few course, but of course it wouldn't be possible without the fantastic experiences that I had teaching Steve's course and the enormous amount that I learned from him about data visualization and teaching. So why exactly did I decide to create this course? Well, there are basically 2 goals. The first is to teach you enough to handle virtually every data visualization challenge that you're likely to encounter in your day-to-day work. This, of course, is a tall order. This is an ambitious goal because, as you know, there are a wide variety of different types of data visualization challenges which can arise in your day-to-day work. And so we're going to move pretty fast, both in this video and in the live workshop, because we're going to have to cover a lot of different topics, a lot of different chart types, a lot of different techniques so that we can actually approach this goal. And I called it Practical Charts because that is very much the goal. It is not fancy. It is not glamorous. My goal isn't to inspire you or to make data beautiful or to tell stories with data, bring data to life. It's so that you know how to handle virtually every challenge that's going to come up in your day-to-day work. So mercilessly practical. In that sense, quite similar to my other major field of interest, which is Israeli self-defense, which I've been studying. I've been studying something called Krav Maga for a couple of years. And surprisingly, I've noticed actually a fair amount of challenges because Krav is also completely practical. It's not fancy. There's no Japanese terminology or anything like that. It's all about getting the job done. And this is very much the approach that I brought to creating this workshop as well. So like Krav, this course contains enough specific techniques to handle the most common challenges. In the case of Krav, it's a tax. Hopefully you won't have to worry about that. But in data visualization, these are just data visualization challenges that arise. And then also enough fundamental principles for you to figure out how to handle the rest. Because of course, I can't teach you how to handle every challenge, every situation, but you should have enough so that you can extrapolate from what you've learned to handle any of those kind of less common or edge case situations. I do have another goal of this course, but I'm going to save that till a little bit later. I'm going to introduce it when I talk about the 9 myths. So there are certain terms that I'm going to be using throughout the course and throughout this video, and it's important to understand how I use them because not everybody uses them in the same way. I define data visualization, what this course is about, as the graphical representation of quantities. When I say chart, this is kind of an umbrella term that includes tables and graphs, or any set of closely related graphs. I tend to use the term author to describe whoever is creating a chart because actually I think that there are parallels, as we'll see, with learning how to write effectively. And I use the generic term audience to describe whoever a chart is for. It could be one person, it could be a million people. They're just the audience. So the reason why I like to start workshops with these 9 data visualization myths is that most of the people I found who come into my data viz workshops have ideas about data visualization that are not quite accurate, and I found that it's important to dispel those misconceptions, those myths, because until I've done so, it's actually quite difficult to create effective visualizations. You'll see that even a lot of data visualization experts actually hold some of these views, and so some of them might be even a little bit controversial, but I do consider them to be misconceptions. You'll know whenever I'm talking about a myth because I'm going to represent it using this highly technical symbol. So in order to tackle the first myth, I want to start with a pretty simple scenario, a story. I'm going to use lots of stories in this video and in the workshop. I like stories. And this is a situation that you're all going to recognize probably. I've got some pretty simple data here, some expense numbers, some budget numbers for the 5 departments in our organization. And I'm going to show you 3 different ways that we could potentially visualize this data. And I want you to look at each one carefully and try to think which one you think is the most effective way of visualizing this particular data. So option A here is not showing the absolute numbers, but showing the differences, the deviations of the actual expenses versus the budget as a percentage. Option B is showing the actual values, the actual expense and budget numbers in this bar chart. And option C is showing the deviation of each department from their budget in dollars. And so I'm going to leave these up for a moment, and I want you to think which one you think is the most effective way of visualizing this data. So if I were to answer this question, I would actually offer option D, which is essentially we cannot know. There is no way of knowing what the best way to visualize this data is based on the data alone. For example, if we were to speak to our target audience and ask them why they needed this data, well, if they were to say something like, I need to cut total expenses, which department should I focus on? Well, then option B here is going to be the best choice. I can see, yeah, I should probably really have a hard look at operations. But if I were to speak to them and discover that instead, actually, they're meeting with the department heads and need to know who's doing a good or poor job of sticking to their budget, well, now option A is going to be the most useful choice for them, right? Because R&D is clearly where they should be focusing because as a percentage of their budget, they're the ones who are really deviating the most. They're performing poorly relative to the others. But again, if I were to speak to them and discover that actually no, they need to get the organization's expenses back under budget, and they want to know which departments they should focus on first, well then option C becomes our best choice. So what's the best way to visualize this data? Well, it could be any of these. And in fact, it could be a virtually infinite number of other possible designs. All right, we can't know unless we know who the target audience is and most importantly, what the purpose of the chart is. The reason for creating that chart in the first place, why we thought the audience needed to see that data. And this brings us to myth number one, which is that there's a best way, an overall best way to visualize a given data set regardless of target, audience, and purpose. In fact, many people, I would say most people, come into my workshops thinking that this is what they're going to learn, right? Is the best way to visualize a given set of data. They don't understand that that's actually not possible. There is no generically useful overall best way to visualize a given set of data. Instead, there are many potentially best ways to visualize a given data set, and the best one depends on the audience and, most importantly, the purpose of the chart. This means that in order to design useful charts, we need to know who the audience is and why they need to see it. This is probably one of the most important takeaways that I want you to get from the whole workshop, which is that in order to create useful charts, we have to know who the target audience is and why they need to see that data in the first place. If the only thing we have is data, we're going to be guessing. We're going to be making essentially random design choices, and there's a pretty low chance that we're going to be lucky and design it in a way that's going to be useful to the audience. By the way, this is actually a major concern that I have with most data visualization design competitions, where somebody will post a data set and then challenge people to come up with the most effective way of representing that data, but without saying who the audience is or what effect you're trying to have on them, what purpose the chart should have. And this is actually kind of futile. This to me is virtually impossible to actually do. If you don't know who the audience is and what effect you're trying to have on them, how can you design the most effective chart? This is also why when people show me a chart and ask me, do you think this is a good chart? My response is usually something like, well, maybe it might be a good chart. If the purpose of this chart is to tell the audience which departments are performing well or poorly relative to their budgets, then yeah, this is a good chart. But if the purpose of this chart is to show which departments have the largest budgets, for example, well, no, then this is not a good chart. So it's kind of like asking, is this a good tool? Well, if you need to tighten some screws, then yeah, it's a good tool. But if you need to cut a 2x4 in half, no, not such a good tool. Now, having said that, there are some charts that are just plain poorly designed, i.e. not really useful for any imaginable purpose. And so I kind of like to think of it this way. For any set of data, there are almost unlimited number of ways that we could potentially visualize that data. There's a large universe, a large space of ways that we could visualize it. And so I like to sort of represent it in my own mind like this. That universe of possible charts can be kind of segmented in this way. First, we have what I call obviously bad charts. And so these are charts where there's really no imaginable purpose where this would be useful. For example, in this chart, I've represented the expenses and budget as a stacked bar chart showing the total of these two numbers added together. And yet it's kind of hard to imagine how this would ever be particularly useful, or if for some reason I decided to represent the expenses as penguins and the budget as mackerel. Again, hard to ever see how this would be the most useful choice. So I'm going to add those to our little diagram here. And then the next category are what I call unobviously bad chart designs. And so these are charts where, unless you've had some training, you might not see the problem, but they're not well designed. For example, we're actually going to see both of these charts a little bit later on. If you haven't had a lot of training or data visualization experience, you might look at them and think, yeah, they look fine. And yet both of these charts are actually quite misleading. And so again, we're going to see both of these a little bit later on. For now, I'm just going to add these to our unobviously bad chart designs. And then the next category are well-designed charts. There's nothing inherently wrong with them, but they just don't serve the target purpose well. And so we've seen some of these already, right? Where we saw that if we discover that our audience needs to know which department is doing a better or poor job of sticking to their budget, well, if we give them one of these are not inherently poorly designed. They're actually well-designed charts, but they simply don't serve that purpose well. And so they're not going to be useful to the audience. And so this problem actually explains a lot of the dissatisfaction that decision makers have with charts. They can't understand why they keep getting these less than useful charts, but it's because the people who are creating them don't know why the audience needed to see them. They don't know why the management team in this case needed to see them in the first place. And as we've seen, if you don't know what the chart is for, it's pretty hard to create charts that are going to be useful to the audience. So we'll add those to our little diagram. And then next, we have well-designed charts that actually serve the target purpose well. And so if we've spoken to the management team, we know why they need the chart, and we create a chart that actually serves that purpose and is also well-designed, well, that's the sweet spot. That's really where we're trying to be. There are also what I call inspired chart designs. They're not fancy, not beautiful. They're just glorious in their clarity and simplicity. If we're lucky, we'll create a couple of these a year. They're not obvious in terms of coming up with that way of representing the information, but when you see it, it just is wonderfully clear and straightforward. And we might see a few of these during the course. And so our goal when creating charts is not to find the best way to visualize this data. This is by far the most common goal that people have in mind. I think our goal should be to design the chart that best serves the purpose for which we decided to create the chart in the first place. Why do we decide to create charts in the first place? Well, it's not just to show the data, right? There's always a sort of a higher level reason. The most common one being to communicate an insight, right? Maybe we found a problem or an opportunity or a pattern, relationship, an outlier that we feel the audience should know about, and a chart is a good way of communicating that to them. Or to answer a question. That's probably the second most common reason why we create charts. Or to support a decision. Sometimes it's to persuade. Maybe we want the audience to take a certain course of action or adopt a certain point of view. There are others, but probably these represent at least 90 or 95% of the reasons why we create charts. There are also other reasons that I'm not going to really talk about in this workshop of creating charts. They're, of course, incredibly useful for actually analyzing data, so not just communicating it. But I'm not going to talk about that during this course. I have a whole other course on using data visualization for analysis. This course is really focusing on data visualization for communication. And so this really has a big impact on how we're going to evaluate the effectiveness of a chart. And so let's say we have design A and design B, and we want to try and figure out which one is going to be most effective. Well, as we've seen, I don't think this is a good question to ask, right? How well does this chart show the data? I also don't think that, looking at how accurately or precisely the audience can perceive the values in this chart, I don't think that's a great way of evaluating the overall effectiveness of a chart. This is something that a lot of researchers, I think, get kind of hung up on. They put maybe a little bit too much weight onto this. But a chart can be very precise, very accurate, and still be useless. We also, of course, should not be asking, how cool does this chart look? This is a big one, right? We're going to talk a little bit more about this in a few moments, but I don't think this is a good way of evaluating the effectiveness of a chart. And instead, we should ask questions like, did the audience actually get their question answered, if that's why we were creating the chart in the first place? Did they get the insight that I was trying to communicate? Or was the audience persuaded, if that's why I was creating this chart in the first place? Did they actually adopt the point of view that I was trying to get them to adopt? Did they make the decision that I wanted them to make? Ultimately, that's what matters. How well did the chart actually serve the purpose for which it was created in the first place? So this actually requires a real shift in thinking for most people, from thinking about things in terms of what they are, what their nature is, to in terms of what they're for. What is their purpose? So for example, I could think of a knife as a tool with a handle and a blade, which is what it is, or I could think about it as a tool for cutting, which is of course what it's for. Similarly, I could think of a chart as a visual representation of data, which of course is what it is, or I could think of it as an answer to a question, or an explanation, or maybe even a sales pitch, depending on why I've created it in the first place. And so this type of thinking actually has a name. It's called teleological thinking. It's not new. It was first discussed by Aristotle when recounting the orations of Socrates 2,400 years ago, where they talked about things having a telos. And I guess there's no real sort of English translation for this. It's maybe closely translated as ultimate purpose or reason for being. But I actually really like this word, and you're going to hear me use it throughout the video and the rest of the workshop. Now, I actually want to add one more goal that I think we shouldn't have to this list, which is something that people commonly think when they come into a workshop, is that they're going to learn how to create objective charts or neutral charts that just show the data, free of any bias or interpretation by the author. I actually think, you might be surprised to learn that this is actually not even theoretically possible. So why would I say something like that? Coming back to our example that we had before of our expense versus budget data, well, as we saw, these are all potentially valid, useful ways to show the same data, and yet we notice different things in each. In A, of course, it looks like R&D is the problem. That's where our focus is going to be. In B, we notice that operations has the highest expenses and budget. That's kind of the visual takeaway of that. And then in option C, our attention is drawn to operations and marketing. It looks like the visual takeaway of that is that those are where the real problems are. And yet, as we saw, they're all showing the same data. And yet, can we say that any of these views are more objective or unbiased than the others? I'm not even really sure how we would actually go about even determining that. And in fact, there is never an unbiased or a neutral version of any chart. And indeed, each of these charts is even more biased than you might realize. Each one is the result of a slew of subjective design decisions that we made while creating them. So if I take option B here as an example, well, when we created this, we decided to use calendar 2019, but we could have used fiscal 2019, but that gives us different numbers, of course, or we could have used trailing 12 months. We decided to show gross expenses as opposed to net expenses. Again, these are actually different numbers. We decided to show our budget as these little sort of horizontal markers, but we could have shown them as a separate set of bars in a clustered bar chart like this. We decided to use this aspect ratio, so the ratio of the height to the width of the chart, but we could have used this one, or we could have used this one. And of course, each one of these decisions affects how people perceive the underlying data. We notice, for example, that in the chart on the right, those differences look a lot more pronounced. And yet, can we say that any of these is the unbiased or neutral version of this chart? I don't think so. And in fact, even just changing the color can affect the way that people perceive the data in subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways. But it's not like any of these design decisions were optional, right? We couldn't not choose a color or not choose a chart type. We had to make these decisions. And so it's kind of like, as the saying goes, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice, which of course was said by the late 20th century philosophers Rush in their classic song Free Will, good Canadian band, which brings us to myth number 2, which is that it's possible to create completely unbiased, objective charts that just show the data. Hopefully I've demonstrated to you that this is in fact not even theoretically possible, that every chart is a product of many judgment calls, all of which affect how audiences perceive the data and the underlying reality that the chart is intended to represent. Ultimately, each chart is the author's interpretation of the data and the purpose of the chart. Every chart is basically a summary, right? We're taking a large amount of information and we're condensing it into a smaller amount of information, and that always involves judgment calls of one type or another. Now I can almost see people's eyebrows making a break for their hairlines at this point, so I want to clarify that this does not mean that it's okay to deliberately bias charts, to create deliberately biased charts. It is not. It's tantamount to lying. I also am not saying that all charts are equally biased. Some charts distort reality much more significantly than others. What I am saying is that we should strive to minimize bias, but we should know that we can never actually eliminate it. So I think this is actually pretty well captured by the very well-known aphorism in statistics that all models are wrong, but some are useful, which of course was said by George Box, famous British statistician in the 1970s, which I like to kind of bastardize as all charts are biased, but some are useful. And so I think that that's ultimately what our goal should be, is usefulness. That's when I'm creating charts, that's what I'm aiming for. The chart should serve the purpose for which it was created. And so that's actually the second goal of this course when I was creating it. It was also to ensure that every chart that you create from now on will be useful. It will serve its telos well. There's actually another myth which is kind of related. It sounds similar, but it's actually a different misconception, which is that if, let's say, I think that chart design A is better than chart design B, there's no way to actually prove that either option is better. It's just ultimately subjective and a matter of opinion. I actually don't think that that's true either, because in theory, we could actually design a controlled experiment and recruit participants, subjects, and test both designs to see which one was actually most effective, which achieved its telos most effectively, which means that we better have a good idea of what the telos actually is, right? If, for example, it's to convince people, we could then measure how many people were actually convinced by the chart and then objectively say that one chart is objectively better than another. That doesn't mean that charts can't objectively portray data, but we can objectively say if one chart is better than another. And that's one of the things that I want you to get from this workshop, is to learn how to make educated guesses about how people will respond to charts of different designs. Because of course, in reality, we virtually never have time or budget to actually run controlled experiments. Now, in order to introduce myth number 4, I'm going to have to hit you with some hard-hitting facts, which is that, unfortunately, in many organizations, a lot of charts get ignored. Now, I know that this never happens in your organization, but I'm here to tell you that this is a very common problem. For example, maybe we work for a charitable organization and we've just launched a big advertising blitz, and we've been tasked with creating a chart that shows the difference from before the blitz to after the blitz. And so we decide to visualize the data this way. And so you think this is pretty interesting, that there's some really important information that the management team should be taking into account in their decision making, but it seems to not really be getting the attention that you think it actually deserves. And so you send it off to the graphic design team and say, here, do something with this, make this more interesting so that people will actually pay attention to it. And they do. They come back with this. I say, whoa, this is very nice, right? It looks super professional, very slick. So you send it back up the management chain, and they seem impressed at first, but it becomes almost immediately clear that they're still not really absorbing what this chart means or using it to actually make decisions. Well, why not? It's because if the purpose of this is to show me what happened between these two time periods, it's actually very difficult to do this, to compare these two charts and see what the differences are. And so, of course, in the data viz world, we have a term for processes that yield charts like this, which is called putting lipstick on a pig, right? Just by making it look nice, we're not going to actually potentially make it more useful. And in fact, we might even make it less useful. Because as we saw, the reason why people weren't engaged by this, the reason why people weren't paying attention to it, was because it was simply too hard to use. It wasn't clear enough about what I should be getting from it. But maybe after you get a bit of training, maybe after you've taken this workshop, you take another crack at it and you come up with something like this. And so it's not any fancier looking, but now it's way more obvious, right? The nature of the data is immediately obvious. I can see that this is a story of things changing over time, things going up and things going down. And even if I didn't draw attention to it, you would probably notice the big story here, which is that 4 of these went up, but 1 of them went down. After our advertising blitz, the central region actually decreased. And so the point of this chart, its telos, its purpose, is immediately obvious, and it requires virtually no conscious effort to actually spot what I should be getting from this. And so even though the redesign on the right is not nearly as slick, it's not nearly as fancy as the one on the left, which one do you think is actually going to get the attention? And ultimately, more importantly, be factored into the decision-making of the management team? Yeah, almost certainly the one on the right. Which brings us to myth number 4, which is the common misconception that the best way to get people to pay attention to charts is with slick graphic design. As we've seen, often it can actually make charts harder to interpret. That 3D effect on the pie charts, for example, actually made it even harder to compare those quantities, and therefore made it actually less useful. The much better way to engage audiences and to get them to pay attention to your charts is to avoid the 6 reasons why charts fail, which I'm going to talk about in just a little bit. In particular, we want to make the chart obvious so people don't have to think too much about what this actually means, and to minimize cognitive effort. And that's something we're going to talk about more a little bit later on as well. And in my experience, the most engaging, successful charts are often visually simple and require no artistic talent to create, which is good news for me because I am not a graphic artist. I have no visual design training. I have no visual arts training. I know a lot about how our visual systems work, but I am not a graphic designer. For example, I could not create a chart that looks like this. This actually got quite a lot of attention. It made the rounds in 2018, 2019. It's a National Geographic chart showing immigration to the US from different parts of the world. If you blow up the legend here, you can see that the different colors represent different parts of the world, and the concentric rings represent time. So you have the 1850s in the center, and it goes out to the 2000s at the edge. And so if the point of this chart is just to make me think, wow, yeah, the US is really kind of a melting pot of different cultures from all over the world, sure, mission accomplished. But if I want to get any more specific than that, it's actually kind of tricky. For example, I can see that immigration from Asia, those pink dots, has been increasing over time, but that's pretty much about all I'd be able to say about it. Has it been a steady increase, or has it increased more than Latin America? There's yellow dots, kind of tough to say. Whereas if I were to represent this as kind of a boring, old, simple line chart, all of a sudden there are like 5 things that jump out at me before I really even had to think about it. The most obvious one being that huge dip in the 1930s and 40s, right? The US immigration policy changed at that point. But that's really, even once you know about it, and you go back to the one on the left, it's not particularly obvious that that's there. In fact, it's almost impossible to spot. Or that almost all the immigration came from Europe in the beginning, that there were spikes from Canada, that's the blue line there at the bottom, after each major US war, or so after the Civil War, the First World War, the Second World War, all sorts of things that jump out at me that are actually not nearly as obvious in that more sort of artistic version on the left. Those have their purpose, but we just have to understand that it's a myth to say that if it looks good, it is good. Because this is a very common misconception, of course. But again, in my experience, the initial visual appeal of a chart has little to do with how useful it actually is. It is possible for charts to be both artistically impressive and useful, but it's rare, not easy to pull off. I certainly don't have the skill set to actually do it. And so I think this is well captured by the Latin phrase esse quam videri, which means it's better to be rather than to seem, in case your Latin is a little bit rusty, which was said by Cicero more than 2,000 years ago. And so Cicero was referring essentially to our behavior and character, but I think it also applies to charts. It's better to be useful rather than to seem useful. So legitimate question at this point, why do bad charts happen to good people, right? Nobody's trying to make bad charts out there. Well, I think that there are probably 2 major reasons. The first is that there's a lot of confusion, a lack of awareness around the skills that are actually required to create useful charts. There's a widespread misconception out there that either graphic designers or data analysts or expert users of software products like Excel or Click or Tableau or Power BI, well, these groups must be really good at creating charts. But in my experience, they often lack the necessary training. For example, graphic designers tend to know how to create visually appealing graphics, but as we've seen, that's not the same thing as useful graphics, and they've often had little training on how to create useful graphics. Data analysts, data scientists, statisticians, obviously great at analyzing data, or hopefully they are, but they've often had little or no training on how to communicate data to others, and as we'll see, that's a really separate skill. Expert users of data visualization or business intelligence products, they've often had a lot of training what can be done with these tools, right? This is how you create a bar chart, this is how to create a line chart, but often relatively little training on what should be done. When should you create a line chart versus a bar chart, for example? So as I see it, there are aspects of these skills that are required in order to create useful charts, but just these skills alone are not sufficient. So I like to think of it this way. If we were to look at all the skills that are necessary to create useful charts, well, of course, we need to know how to use the tools. But then there are elements of data analysis, right? We need to have a certain level of data literacy. And like a data analyst, we need to know the domain of the data. If it's insurance data, we should know something about insurance, for example. And of course, the target audience, we've seen how important that is. There are also elements of graphic design. There's creativity. And I'm not talking about artistic creativity, but being able to come up with often very clever ways of showing data, but clever in their clarity. It also helps a lot to know something about the capabilities and limitations of the human visual system, and oftentimes graphic designers have that knowledge as well, and we're going to talk a little bit about that during the course as well. There's one other skill set though, because just these skills are not sufficient. Unfortunately, there's not a sort of a widely recognized term for these. I call these data communication skills. And these are other skills that we're going to learn basically during the course that people are not taught in these other disciplines. And so data communication skills are actually more akin to writing skills than probably any of these other skills in this diagram. And of course, these are the skills we're going to focus on during the workshop. So that's the first reason why I think bad charts happen to good people. The second is much more kind of mundane, which is that people often emulate big software vendors. But especially after you've taken this course, you'll see once you start looking at their marketing and training materials, they're just unfortunately laced with bad practices very often. If you look at their blogs, their marketing materials, even their training documentation, you'll just see really terrible examples out there, which is very unfortunate. I actually consult with a lot of these companies and train them, and they are slowly getting better. But unfortunately, a lot of the stuff in especially their marketing materials, is not worth emulating. And yet it's so easy to say, oh, well, if it's good enough for Microsoft or it's good enough for IBM, it's good enough for me, right? Well, unfortunately, that's our myth number 7, which is that charts in data visualization software's training and marketing materials must be good, right? Unfortunately, they're often laced with bad practices, ineffective charts, which means that we have to take anything from them with a boulder of salt. They have people internally who know what they're doing, but unfortunately, a lot of people haven't learned that knowledge. That knowledge is not universal within these organizations. So how big a problem is this? Lots of charts are poorly designed, poorly created. Well, as you can imagine, it's a pretty big problem, right? If we look at the amount of time and effort and money that organizations such as yours, because they all do it, spend tons of resources on acquiring data and storing it, aggregating it, making it available internally, externally, layering on often expensive business intelligence, data visualization reporting tools. Well, unfortunately, that final step where you have humans, where you have people using those tools to create the things that decision makers actually see, well, unfortunately, those are often so poorly designed that it basically compromises all of that other value and investment. And this brings us to myth number 8, which is the belief that not knowing much about data visualization makes you a beginner. Now, this is going to sound kind of harsh, but I think that it makes you somebody who creates charts that lead to bad decisions, i.e. charts that misrepresent reality, fail to surface key insights, maybe don't get read because they simply require too much effort, right? Everybody complains, oh, my organization doesn't make data-driven decisions. Well, if the charts that they're looking at are just too hard to read, too confusing, or just not obvious enough, it becomes kind of understandable as to why this is the case. For a lot of my clients, of course, this means a lot of waste, potential lost opportunities. For others in the healthcare sector, in the military, this can mean lost lives. And so there's a huge responsibility that we have if we're creating charts to make them clear, useful, and effective. Now, the good news is that it's actually not that hard to learn how to create useful, non-damaging charts. And that's really what this course is about. From here, I'm just going to jump right into the 9th and final myth in this section, which is that the common belief that chart type selection is based entirely on the nature of the data to be shown. And so this is, again, something that people often come into my workshop thinking that, oh, we're going to learn that for time series data, for example, we always use line charts. And for showing parts of a whole, parts of a total, we always use pie charts, things like that. And this is kind of actually the thinking that underlines a lot of these, which probably a lot of you have seen, these sort of chart type selection tools, which are, there are many of them floating around the internet. But I believe that these are actually kind of dangerously oversimplistic because, as we've started to see, and we're going to see more in the rest of the course, when we're choosing a chart type, that depends in part on the nature of the data. For example, is it time series data, or is there location information in it? How many values? Are there many values or few? There are many things that we need to consider in terms of the nature of the data, but that's not sufficient. We also need to look at the telos, the purpose of the chart. And that's going to drive many of our design decisions as well, as we've seen, and we'll see more examples of this shortly. It also depends on the level of graphicacy of the audience. Yes, it's a word. We have literacy, numeracy, and graphicacy, which is the ability to read graphs. And as you've all probably experienced in your own practice, This can vary widely between people. Some people have very high levels of graphicacy, others low. In certain audiences, they're very familiar with certain chart types, but not others. And so we need to take all of this information into account when we're choosing chart types and making most other design decisions as well. Some key takeaways. What have we learned from the 9 myths? Well, we've learned that when we're designing charts, our ultimate goal is not to answer a question or tell a story, prompt the user to take action, support decision making, represent the data as accurately or precisely as possible, or to be visually engaging, or to just show the data in a neutral, sort of bias-free way. And you'll hear these kind of bandied around as common goals or reasons why we should be creating charts. Ultimately, though, I think that these are common sub-goals that apply to varying degrees. Sometimes we need to tell a story, but sometimes we don't. Sometimes we're supporting a decision, but sometimes we're not. Ultimately, in the service of creating useful charts. Ultimately, that's what matters, is did the chart serve the purpose for which it was created in the first place? Right? And so the goals on the left are goals that apply sometimes, but not all the time. We also learned that there's no overall best way to visualize a given data set that's going to be useful to any audience or purpose. There are always many, in fact, a virtually unlimited number of potentially best ways, and it depends on the audience and the purpose, which means that if we only have the data and we don't know why the audience needs to see it, or even sometimes who the audience even is, then we're going to be making random design decisions, and it's probably not going to work out very well. We also learned that many design decisions, including chart type selection, are based not just on the nature of the data, but also on the chart's purpose and who the audience is, that the visual appeal of a chart has little to do with how useful it actually is, and that being an expert graphic designer, data analyst, or software user doesn't automatically make you good at creating useful charts. There are those other data communication skills that you need to learn as well, and that having little training in data visualization doesn't make you a beginner, it makes you dangerous. All right, so now that we actually have a better understanding of what we're actually trying to do when we're creating charts, let's get a little bit more specific about exactly how we're going to create these useful charts. And this is by essentially avoiding the 6 reasons why charts fail to be useful. If we can avoid these 6 problems, we will, by definition, have charts that are useful. So the first reason why charts fail to be useful is that the audience is simply not willing to interpret it. And there are two kind of sub-reasons why this happens. The first is that maybe the chart is too busy. And so this often happens when, for example, we're not sure which kind of view we want to present of the data. We have a couple of different types of questions that we can answer about it. And we figure, oh, well, this is all basically showing the same data, so I'll just combine it all into the same chart. But this yields what I call a spaghetti chart. Obviously, if we present our audience with something like this, they might simply be unwilling to spend the cognitive effort to actually interpret it. And so I actually want to take a bit of a sidebar and talk about that, talk about cognitive effort for a little bit, because this is actually a really important concept to understand. So our brains only account for about 2% of our overall body weight, but they actually use about 20% of the body's energy. So our brains are very cognitively expensive. And so we're always trying to conserve cognitive energy. We basically want to think as little as possible. And so this is why when we see a chart that requires a lot of visual processing, our brains essentially want to turn away, right? We've all felt that unpleasant sensation where we look at something very complex and we can actually feel it physically almost. And it's actually a good thing that our brains work this way, because if we devoted intense attention to interpreting everything that we saw, our brains would burn through all of our body's energy and we'd literally starve to death within a matter of hours. And so when somebody doesn't want to put in the effort to understand a chart that you've created, they're probably not being lazy. They're probably just trying to avoid starving to death. So when we're creating data visualizations, it's important to understand that there are some types of visual tasks that our brains find effortless and easy to perform, but others that our brains find difficult and energy intensive. And obviously we want to try and avoid those tasks. And it's actually pretty easy to see the differences between these easy and hard visual tasks for yourself with simple demonstrations like this. So in a moment, I'm going to show you a list of digits. It's going to be about 200 numbers on the screen, and I want you to pick out the number of 5s that you see. And so I'll leave it up for about 15 seconds. So ready? 3, 2, 1, go. All right, I'll stop torturing you. I shortchanged you. I think it was about 12 seconds, but hopefully you got the number of fives. Don't worry if you didn't. I'm actually going to ask you now to do the same task, to find the fives, and I'm going to show you basically the same image, but just with one very minor change. Huh. Kind of odd, eh? You probably managed to do this in under a second. In fact, probably way under 1 second. And yet it was actually basically the same task. In both cases, your brain had to look at 200 numbers and pick out the fives. So what's going on here? Why were you able to perform one task so much faster and so much more effortlessly than the other? Well, since the 1970s or so, cognitive scientists have discovered that there are basically two types of information processing, two types of thinking that our brains perform. The first type is thinking that we're aware of. And so this is very slow, deliberate, effortful, but it's versatile. We can do many different types of thinking with this part of our minds. And then there's thinking that we're not aware of. And so this tends to be fast, automatic, effortless, but it's not as versatile, right? We have these kind of pre-programmed subroutines, these specific tasks that we're able to perform very quickly. And cognitive scientists actually have names for these. They call them System 1 and System 2. System 1 is actually on the right, System 2 is on the left. And we know that actually most of the thinking that we do is that unconscious System 1 kind of thinking. And so whenever we're presented with a new visual task, like this one, for example, we obviously try and do it with that fast, effortless part of our brains first. We see, do we have kind of a subroutine for this? And for this kind of task, actually, we do not. And so anything that our brains cannot handle automatically, well, then it passes it up to the more versatile, but conscious, slow, deliberate, effortful part of our minds. And so that's why that first task was so much slower and so much more effortful for you to perform. But if we encounter a task that we do have one of those kind of subroutines for, and in this case, that subroutine is actually detection of different color intensities, say, yep, we can do that one automatically. Great. And so obviously we want most of our data visualizations to work like this, to require as little effortful conscious processing as possible, that as much as possible can be done automatically. If you're interested in this, there's a fantastic book about this called Thinking Fast and Slow by Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman, who actually discovered a lot of these principles in recent decades. So when we're designing charts then, we want to design them so that they can be visually processed with as little effort as possible. How do we do this? Well, let's look at a few examples. So when we first see an image like this, there are many tasks that our brains do automatically and effortlessly. For example, we recognize it as a chart. We don't have to consciously think, oh, what kind of image is this? It just happens automatically. We separate the foreground objects like the lines from the background, like the grid lines. We separate text from graphical objects. Long list of things that we do automatically until we get to the legend at the bottom. Now all of a sudden, boom, everything slows down. Our eyes start moving back and forth, up and down. We have to start consciously remembering, oh yeah, orange is marketing and yellow is IT. And so we have to sort of engage that conscious part of our minds now. But if we do a little bit of redesign, we can actually minimize that conscious effort. Even a simple change like this, where we're now making the legend sort of more in line or aligned with the graphical objects, requires less cognitive effort. This requires even less. Same information though. And so just through better design, we can go from an image which is slow, deliberate, effortful to visually process to something that is fast, automatic, and effortless. Another example. Let's look at this horrible axis label, right? We almost have to look at each character individually before we realize, oh, it says transactions, right? Little change, easier now. Another change, effortless now. Or let's say we want our audience to compare these four numbers. Well, it's going to be kind of tough in this arrangement. If we rearrange them like this, now it's easier like this, way easier, much faster. Wall of numbers, this is going to be a real headache. It's going to be slow to process. Again, make a simple design change, all of a sudden it's going to be much faster. And we're going to see many examples of reducing cognitive effort in the workshop, so you develop an intuitive sense of what makes charts easier or more difficult to visually process. Important point here, though, is that cognitive effort also depends on telos, it depends on purpose. And so if the purpose of this chart, for example, is just to show which department spent the most, well, yeah, I'm going to be able to process this with almost no conscious thought. But if we change the telos, so now it's not which department is the most, it's who's doing a better or worse job of sticking to their budget. Now, all of a sudden, this is slow and effortful. And so again, we can't really know if a chart is going to be cognitively effortless until we know what it is actually for. Now, we can't always eliminate all conscious processing from charts. For example, where something like this is a well-designed chart, requires minimal conscious effort, but if it's on a dashboard, for example, where it's going to be updated automatically, we might end up with situations like this, in which case maybe we have to make a bit of a compromise and have a separate legend. And so it's going to require a little bit more conscious effort, basically making the point that we can't always eliminate all conscious effort from the interpretation of charts, but we can go a long way to minimizing it. So that's why when we present our audiences with something like this, the problem isn't that the data is not there. It is. It's just that it requires too much cognitive conscious effort for them to interpret, and so they're likely to turn away. Whereas taking the same information and rearranging it in a different way might make it a little bit cognitively easier. The second major reason why audiences are unwilling to interpret a chart that we've created is that it's too ugly. We've all seen these, right? Fugly charts. Sometimes people ask me if it's really necessary to pay attention to the aesthetic design of charts that will only ever be used for internal decision making, though. And well, as this example hopefully shows, yes, we have to pay at least some attention to it. And there are essentially three reasons why we want to avoid ugly charts. The first is that unless the user really needs the data in a chart like this to do their job, they're often just going to skip over it. It's just too unpleasant to look at it. Second reason is that it can actually be distracting. People end up thinking about how ugly the chart is and not about the data, which is usually not what we want. And the third is that it can actually reduce the credibility of the data in the chart, right? If the chart author clearly knows nothing about chart design, it kind of raises the question of like, well, what other skills are they lacking? Do they lack maybe some statistical skills? Like, how much should I actually trust the data? Now, having said that, we don't need to be graphic designers. We don't need to be graphic artists. There's no need to make beautiful charts. And it's actually quite easy to design non-ugly chart. There's no artistic talent required, which, as we've seen, is good news for people like me who have none. We can follow a few pretty simple guidelines that we're going to look at later on in the workshop in order to easily avoid making ugly charts. So those are the two main reasons why audiences are generally not willing to even interpret a chart. The next major reason why charts fail is, of course, that an audience might be willing to interpret a chart, but they might not be able to. And there are three common reasons why that happens. The first is that the chart might be using an unfamiliar chart type or technique. For example, maybe we've used a scatter plot for audiences who don't really know how to read scatter plots. And if you're not sure what this is, if you're not familiar with scatter plots, don't worry. We're going to talk about these a little bit later on. Instead, maybe though, if you have an audience or a situation like this, something like a merged bar chart, also called a table lens, might be more familiar to them. Or maybe we've shown them a histogram. And again, if you're not sure what this is, don't worry. We're going to talk about these in the live workshop. But if you're worried that your audience might not understand it, maybe something like this, which is called a strip plot, might be more intuitive to them. Second reason why audiences might not be able to interpret a chart that we've created is inadequate labeling. This, unfortunately, is something that happens all the time. First glance, these charts look fine, right? Here we have expenses over 12 months, right? But without any units of measurement, we don't know actually what these numbers even are. Are they transactions, dollars, euros? Is this cumulative or is it monthly totals? Are these all expenses or just paid or payable expenses? In the chart on the right, we have year to date, but hopefully it's this year. Hopefully this isn't something that's been a printout that's been lying on somebody's desk for the last 2 years or something, and doesn't really tell us up to when. Again, hopefully it's up to now, but if this were a PDF or something without a date on it, we wouldn't know. We wouldn't actually be able to interpret this chart. It would actually be kind of meaningless to us. The commonly forgotten types of chart labeling are dates all the time, complete dates, not just day, month, but also year, measure names, units of measurement, any kind of filtering or data processing that's been applied to the data prior to creating the chart. Are these all expenses or just paid expenses or payable expenses, for example? Data sources, if that's important, and it often is, like where did the data actually come from? Contact information of the author, of course. People have questions. Everybody forgets to put that in. And then sometimes if we are creating charts that have sort of statistical information, obviously we need to put the relevant statistical measures in there, number of values, correlation coefficients, and the like. The third major reason why people are unable to interpret charts are the fact that there is hidden data in there. And again, unfortunately, this happens a lot more often than people realize. At first glance, a potentially useful chart showing donations by region and payment method. But I certainly hope that I'm not interested in what the cash donations were, those gray bars in the Eastern region, because I cannot see them. One of several problems with 3D, but we'll talk more about 3D as well a little bit later. This, of course, unfortunately happens fairly regularly too, where I have this overplotting problem. And so essentially data on top of data, which of course prevents people from actually interpreting the chart. So those are the reasons why people are not able to interpret charts. Third reason why charts fail is misinterpretation, where the audience might think that they're interpreting the chart correctly, but in fact they are not. And this is something that, again, happens a lot more than people realize. Even when we're trying to be as honest and straightforward as possible, not trying to deceive anyone, as we'll see, it's surprisingly easy to create charts that accidentally misrepresent the underlying data and therefore misrepresent the underlying reality that the data is supposed to represent. For example, maybe we've created a chart of our organization's headcount by region, but we want to draw attention to the central region, and so we make some color changes, make all the other regions gray, and just leave the central region as orange. Great, yeah, I think this works well. We've drawn attention to the central region. However, we've introduced some ambiguity here. For example, if I look at the north and west lines, they intersect in June, and before that, it actually becomes quite unclear in terms of which line is which. And so this chart is actually misleading, even though the person who created it was not trying to mislead anyone. So how could we do it? How could we draw attention to the central line? There are a wide array of methods that we can use, and in fact, we're going to talk about those later on in the workshop. We could use something like this. We could increase the thickness of the line, the color saturation a little bit, and now we have a chart which is drawing attention to what we wanted to draw attention to, but without actually deceiving anyone. Another example. So we've got some donations here by region. Kind of boring, right? They're all pretty similar to one another. This might be okay if the purpose is to simply show that all these values are very similar to one another. However, if we actually wanted to feature those small differences, well, we could do something like this. And so instead of starting our scale at 0, we're starting at 320,000. So just showing the range that the data actually occupies. But of course, if the audience is not paying attention, they're going to think that the West is less than half of the East, for example. And so this is also potentially highly misleading. If we had a situation like this, we could use what I call an inset chart. And this is an example of what I call a data viz ninja trick. There's going to be lots more of those in the workshop. We kind of get the best of both worlds. We can see the big picture in terms of how these values compare with one another on a scale that starts at 0, and we can also see those small differences between them. Now, of course, these accidental miscommunications are not specific to data visualization. They happen with all forms of communication. I'm sure that the writer of this sign did not want to say that the toilet is only for disabled, elderly, pregnant children. And hopefully this Wendy's restaurant is actually not incorporating human beings into their burgers, but they are hiring. All right, next on our list of reasons why charts fail to be useful is that the basic nature of the data in the chart is not obvious. So let me explain exactly what I mean by that. So if I were to show you a chart like this, where I've blurred the text, this technique actually has a name. It's called the squint test, where you kind of squint your eyes. You don't need software to do it, and you kind of blur the text so you only see the graphical elements. And when I do that, it looks like, basically this looks like 4 categories of things showing 2 measures for each category. But then if I represent the same data a little bit differently, well, now the nature of the data looks quite different, right? It looks like 2 things that are basically changing over time. And then if I unblur my eyes, I can see that actually that choice on the right-hand side makes the basic nature of the data, i.e. things changing over time, which is what this data is, a little bit more obvious. And so the case on the left, not so obvious; case on the right, more obvious. Not saying that lines are necessarily better than bars, but in this case, they make that nature of the data more obvious. Here's another example of a situation where the basic nature of the data was not very clear. So this is actually from a recent edition of the Wall Street Journal. And the story here is about how the number of arrests in Hong Kong has been increasing over time. And yet, does this chart look like something increasing over time? Certainly not at first glance. I think part of the problem might be that if we were to trace the path of time through this, it would actually look like this. Something like this, however, makes it much more obvious what the basic nature of the data is, in this case, i.e. something increasing over time, which is a good thing. Or another example, I've squint tested these. And so what can we tell about the basic nature of the data of the graph on the left? Well, just that there are 5 quantities, essentially. The graph on the right, however, looks not just like 5 quantities, but 5 quantities that are the parts of a total, of a whole. And if I unblur, I can see actually, yeah, that is the nature of the data in this particular case. These are parts of a whole, parts of a total. So yes, that is actually an advantage of pie charts. Pie charts do have their benefits, and we're going to talk more about those later on in the course. So the next reason, the 5th in our 6 reasons why charts fail to be useful, is that the purpose of the chart is not obvious. We've all had experiences like this, right? Where you're looking at a chart and saying, okay, I get it, I understand it, but what's the point? Is there a message here? Is there a question that's being answered? And so there are basically 2 ways that we can make the purpose of a chart obvious. The first is through the graphical elements, and so our chart type choices, color choices, highlighting choices, etc. And then, of course, obviously through the textual elements, through the chart title, callouts, notes, annotations. So let's talk first about how we can make charts obvious using graphical elements. So in this case, the nature of the data is fairly obvious for both of these charts, right? It's a breakdown of 3 totals, but the actual purpose of the chart is not as clear in the one on the left, because this just simply says, that's all I get from this graphically, is a breakdown of 3 totals. Whereas here, I can see that this is not just a breakdown of 3 totals, but that the third one has a lot more of something. So before I've even read any text, I can get more of the actual point of this chart just from the graphical elements. And so if I were to add the actual message that I wanted to convey through this chart, as a callout, for example, I can see that, yeah, that actually was the main purpose of the chart, was to show that that aggressive portfolio has more of something, specifically higher risk assets. And so in this case, the chart on the left is actually not as graphically obvious as the chart on the right. And even if I blur out all the text altogether, I can still see that the purpose of this chart is to show the breakdown of 3 totals, and that one of those totals has a lot more of something, even before I've actually started reading any text. And so making the purpose of a chart graphically obvious is another one of our ninja tricks. Now, of course, the other major way that we make the purpose of a chart obvious is with text, right? And so I'm a big fan of actually including the message of a chart directly in the chart as, in this case, a callout. And in fact, I'll even put the message as the title of the chart itself. Maybe even add a little arrow just to make it really obvious and explicit in terms of what I want you to get from this chart. What is the point? Why did I think you needed to see this data? So the main takeaways here are that as much as possible, we want the purpose of a chart to be obvious from its graphical elements alone. So before the person even starts reading, ideally they have a good idea of what they should be paying attention to and what they should be getting from the chart. And then those textual elements, the titles and callouts, are only there to add supporting detail, and they should not be relied on entirely to communicate the entire purpose of the chart. So now the 6th and final reason why charts fail is that the purpose of the chart is simply not relevant or useful to the audience. And so they were willing to look at it, they were able to interpret it, they didn't misinterpret it, the nature of the data and the purpose were obvious, but it's just telling them something that really they have no use for, they didn't need to know. And so we've kind of talked about this already, right? Where we knew what the audience wanted, but we created charts that didn't really serve that purpose well. And so that then becomes our sixth and final reason why charts fail. So legitimate question then, right? Really? Like, how common are these problems? They seem so obvious when you see them illustrated in this way, right? Well, unfortunately, as you can tell from my little animation here, pretty common. And in fact, even in places where you would least expect it, like major news media outlets, research papers, scientific documents, places where you'd think they know better. And yet, unfortunately, many charts, even in my experience, most charts, suffer from at least one of these problems. People email me examples of terrible charts all the time. Unfortunately, there's just an endless supply out there. Well, the good news here is that if we can avoid the 6 reasons why charts fail, we will, by definition, have charts that have succeeded. And there's more good news, which is that it's actually surprisingly easy to learn how to do this. That's kind of the deep, dark little secret of what I do, is that it's not that hard. But let's get specific now. So exactly how do we do this? How do we design charts that don't suffer from the 6 reasons why charts fail? So this is what we're going to learn about in the rest of the workshop. So the major sections of the Practical Charts course are the first 2 that we've covered, the 9 data visualization myths and the 6 reasons why charts fail. Next, we're going to look at formatting charts, specifically borders, grid lines, tick marks, and the like. Scales, of which there are 4 major types: name categories, quantitative, specifically linear scales, interval time. Don't worry if you're not familiar with these terms, I'm going to explain them all. Of course, we're going to talk about color, hugely important when we're trying to make charts clear and obvious. Legends, obviously hugely important as well. And a few minor notes about text, so things like fonts and font sizes, number formatting, that kind of thing. And then the largest section of the workshop, which is sort of the middle half or so of the workshop, is going over what I call the big 7 chart types. And so these are the chart types that tend to sort of come to mind first in a lot of situations for most people. The big 7, of course, are line charts, pie charts, histograms, scatter plots, maps, bar charts, and tables. When we're discussing each of the big 7 chart types, we'll also look at 6 or 7 variants and alternatives to that type, which will allow us to see when it makes sense to use things like stacked bar charts, heat maps, waterfall charts, and over 50 other important chart types. We're then going to talk a little bit more about making charts obvious, and then near the end of the workshop, we'll talk about some common data visualization challenges and solutions, things like how do you visualize cyclical or seasonal data, how do you handle outliers, challenges of that nature. We're then going to talk about some common questions that arise. People often ask about things like combo charts, or dual axis charts, or 3D, for example, or even virtual reality or artificial intelligence. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about those. And then finally wrap up with a section that I just call What Now? What do you do with all of this newfound knowledge? How do you get this out into your organization and change the culture so that people are both creating and expecting visualizations that are going to be genuinely useful for them? A few other things that might crop up. There are going to be 8 group activities, including several design challenges where I'm going to give you a realistic design scenario and you'll be challenged to come up with a chart that responds to that scenario effectively. There's going to be lots more data viz ninja tricks, some research tidbits to impress your friends, and a couple of bonus myths that we're going to actually hit a little bit later on. I found it's also useful to let people know what we're not going to cover, because sometimes people are not even clear on what data visualization actually means. So in this course, we're not going to talk about sort of artistic infographic style graphs for the reasons that I've mentioned already. I'm also not going to talk about specific software applications. Everything I talk about in the course, you can do using Excel or other major modern data visualization software products. There's nothing fancy in there. And the bottom line is that the best practices aren't different depending on what software you use to actually create a graph in the first place. I'm also not going to talk about diagrams, things like flow charts or org charts, Venn diagrams. Those are actually a different category of image. They're not visualizations of quantities. We're also not going to talk about dashboards because that's a whole other topic, and I actually offer another course on dashboards. Same thing with data analysis, whole other topic, whole other course. And sometimes in workshops, there are data governance questions that come up. And people will say, well, the challenge for me is that we don't even agree on what a full-time employee actually means, for example. And that, to me, is really going outside of data visualization and into data policy and data governance. So thanks very much for watching this first part of the Practical Charts course. I hope that you found it interesting and enlightening. If you're registered for an upcoming online workshop, I look forward to seeing you there shortly. Make sure to have any comments or questions that arose as you were watching this handy, because you will have the opportunity to ask those questions and make those comments at the beginning of the workshop. If you're not registered for an upcoming workshop, you can, of course, find more information about how to take this course on my website, practicalreporting.com. But in either case, thanks very much for watching.